Professor Zixnax adjusted his ocular appendages, desperately trying to maintain his composure as he stared at the human student before him. The Galactic University of Advanced Warfare prided itself on nurturing the finest military minds across the cosmos. But this Deathworlder was pushing the boundaries of sanity itself. Mr. Johnson Zixnax began, his voice a mixture of exasperation and barely concealed horror. Could you please explain to the class why you believe just nuke it from orbit is an appropriate response to a minor border dispute? Dave Johnson, the sole human in a classroom full of alien species, leaned back in his chair with a nonchalant shrug. Well, Prof, sometimes you gotta go big or go home. You know, he paused to take a sip from his thermos, which the other students strongly suspected contained something far stronger than coffee. Besides, it's not like we'd actually do it. It's just to show him we mean business. A collective gasp echoed through the classroom. The Florvexian students' bioluminescent patches flickered in distress, while the Centauri delegation's tentacles writhed in agitation. Professor Zixnax fought the urge to slam his gelatinous head against the nearest hard surface. Mr. Johnson, perhaps I wasn't clear in my initial briefing. The scenario involves a disagreement over the ownership of a small asteroid belt. The suggested course of action should not involve planetary annihilation. Dave chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down the spines or equivalent anatomical structures of his classmates. Aw, come on, Prof, it's just a little thermonuclear deterrence. Works wonders back home. You should see how quickly disputes get settled when someone brings up the big guns. The professor's color shifted from a calm blue to an alarming shade of puce. Mr. Johnson, I must remind you that this institution adheres to the Galactic Convention on Ethical Warfare. We do not nuke it from orbit as a first, second, or even last resort. Theft? Conventions, Dave scoffed, rolling his eyes. Back on Earth, we've got a saying, rules of war are like New Year's resolutions. Everyone makes them, nobody keeps them. A Meplorpian student in the front row fainted, their gelatinous body puddling onto the floor with a sad plop. Zixnax took a deep breath, trying to center himself. Very well, Mr. Johnson. Let's approach this from another angle. What would you suggest as a non-nuclear alternative? Dave's eyes lit up, a sight that filled the professor with immediate regret. Oh, I've got just the thing. You ever heard of these babies we call MOBAs? Massive ordnance air blast, it's like a nuke, but without all that pesky radiation. We drop one of those bad boys and boom, problem solved. And the asteroid belt's still maniable. Once the debris settles, of course. The class erupted into chaos. The Centauri students began a telepathic chant for inner peace, while the Florvexians huddled together, their bioluminescence dimming to a faint, terrified glow. Professor Zixnax raised all four of his arms, trying to restore order. Class, please. Compose yourselves, he turned back to Dave, his voice strained. Mr. Johnson, the purpose of this exercise is to find a diplomatic solution. Dave leaned forward, a mischievous glint in his eye. Oh, I get it, Prof, you want us to try the sneaky approach. How about we send in some covert ops teams? A little sabotage here, a staged accident there, and before you know it, they're begging us to take the asteroid belt off their hands. The room fell silent, save for the soft plop of another Meplorpian fainting. Zixnax's ocular appendages twitched uncontrollably. Mr. Johnson, that is not. We do not. That's espionage. Tomato, Dave said with a wink. Sometimes you gotta grease the wheels of diplomacy with a little cloak and dagger action, you know. A Toraxian student raised a trembling claw. Professor, is the human suggesting we commit war crimes? Dave spun around in his chair, grinning at his classmate. War crimes? Nah, buddy. We like to call it aggressive negotiation where I'm from. It's all about perspective. The professor slumped against his desk, wondering if it was too late to retire. Mr. Johnson, please. Just suggest something that doesn't involve explosion, subterfuge, or violations of galactic law. Dave scratched his chin thoughtfully. All right. How about this? We challenge them to a drinking contest. Winner takes the asteroid belt. Zixnax blinked all six of his eyes in rapid succession. What? Yeah, you know, a good old-fashioned drink off. Dave's enthusiasm was palpable. We humans have livers of steel. We'll outdrink any species in the galaxy. It's like biological warfare, but fun. The professor's color shifted to a pale, sickly yellow. Mr. Johnson, are you suggesting we resolve an interstellar conflict with alcoholic beverages? Dave nodded vigorously. Absolutely. It's foolproof. If we win, we get the asteroid belt. If we lose, well, we'll be too hammered to care about some floating rocks anyway. It's a win-win. A Toraxian student cautiously raised a claw. Professor, is this how humans typically conduct diplomacy? Before Zixnax could respond, Dave chimed in. Oh yeah, all the time. You should see our UN meetings. Half the resolutions are made over vodka shots and tequila slammers. The professor made a mental note to fact-check that statement later. For now, he focused on damage control. While I appreciate your creative approach, Mr. Johnson, perhaps we should explore more conventional diplomatic channels. Dave's face fell. Aw, come on, Prof. Where's the fun in that? Conventional diplomacy is so boring. Where I'm from, we like to spice things up a bit, keep our opponents on their toes, you know. A Centauri student's tentacles curled in confusion, but the Galactic Diplomatic Handbook clearly states, "Handbook, schmanbook," Dave interrupted with a dismissive wave. "In the real world, you gotta be ready to improvise. Think outside the box, or outside the galaxy, in this case." Professor Zixnax felt a headache building in all three of his brains. "Mr. Johnson, while adaptability is indeed a valuable trait, there are established protocols for a reason. Perhaps you could suggest a more traditional approach." Dave sighed dramatically. "Fine. If you insist on being all boring and stuff, how about we offer them something they can't refuse? Like, I don't know, our collection of Earth's finest memes." The classroom fell silent once again, this time out of sheer confusion. Mims Zixnax repeated, unsure if his universal translator was malfunctioning. "Yeah, you know, those funny pictures with captions. Earth's greatest cultural export." Dave's eyes gleamed with excitement. "We've got decades worth of top-tier memes. Grumpy Cat, Doge, Rickrolls, the works. It's like offering them the entire history of human humor in one package." The professor blinked slowly, trying to process this new information. "Mr. Johnson, are you suggesting we barter an asteroid belt for images with humorous captions?" Dave nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. It's the perfect trade. They get priceless cultural artifacts, we get some space rocks. Everyone's happy." A Florvexian student's bioluminescent patches flickered in a pattern that roughly translated to what the actual quantum flux. Zixnax took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of patience he possessed. "While I'm sure these memes are indeed valuable to humans, I'm not certain they hold the same appeal for other species. Perhaps we could explore more universally recognized forms of trade." Dave's face lit up. "Oh, I've got it. We'll challenge them to a game of chicken in space." The professor's color drained entirely, leaving him a translucent blob of disbelief. "Chicken? In space? Mr. Johnson, please tell me you're not suggesting what I think you're suggesting." No, hear me out." Prof. Dave leaned forward, gesticulating wildly. "We each take our biggest, baddest warship, right? Then we fly straight at each other. Full speed. First one to swerve loses the asteroid belt. It's foolproof." The classroom erupted into chaos once again. The Centauri students began a collective meditation to cope with the stress, while the Florvexians' bioluminescence strobed in patterns that would probably trigger seizures in most species. Professor Zixnax slumped against his desk, all pretense of composure abandoned. "Mr. Johnson, that is quite possibly the most reckless, irresponsible, and downright insane proposal I have ever heard in my 3 centuries of teaching." Dave beamed with pride. "Thanks, Prof. I knew you'd see the genius of it eventually." The professor raised a gelatinous appendage. "That wasn't a compliment, Mr. Johnson. That was an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror at the casual disregard for life and property you've just displayed." "Aw, come on," Dave protested. "It's not like we'd actually crash. It's all about the bluff, the bravado. Whoever's got the biggest, thrusters, wins." A Thoraxian student chittered nervously. But what if neither side swerves?" Dave shrugged. "Then I guess we solve 2 problems at once, the border dispute and overpopulation." The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the soft plop of the last conscious Meplorpian finally fainting. Professor Zixnax's ocular appendages swiveled wildly, taking in the scene of devastation that was once his orderly classroom. Unconscious Meplorpians, hyperventilating Florvexians, and catatonic Centauri filled the room. And in the midst of it all sat Dave Johnson, grinning like a lunatic and apparently oblivious to the havoc he'd wrought. With a Herculean effort, the professor pulled himself together. "Mr. Johnson, I think perhaps it's time we took a short break. Class, please take 10 minutes to recover. And someone please rehydrate the Meplorpians." As the shell-shocked students filed out of the room, many casting fearful glances at the still grinning human, Professor Zixnax collapsed into his chair. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a bottle of Rigelian Hyper Whiskey, and took a long, deep swig. "Galactic University of Advanced Warfare," he muttered to himself. "More like Galactic University of Giving Main an Aneurysm." Dave approached the desk, either oblivious to or simply ignoring the professor's distress. "Hey, Prof, I've been thinking. If the drinking contest is off the table, how about we settle this with a good old-fashioned dance-off?" Zixnax stared at the human, then at the bottle in his hand, then back at the human. Without a word, he took another long drink. Dave, undeterred, continued. "Picture this, we set up a massive space station, invite representatives from both sides, and then, bam, we drop the sickest beats this side of the Andromeda galaxy. Whoever's got the best moves wins the asteroid belt. It's perfect." The professor slowly lowered the bottle, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Johnson, are you actually suggesting we determine the fate of valuable space real estate based on rhythmic body movements?" "Exactly," Dave exclaimed, his eyes shining with excitement. "We humans have been settling disputes this way for centuries. Haven't you ever seen West Side Story?" Zixnax made a mental note to update the curriculum to include more comprehensive studies of human culture. Clearly, there were some significant gaps in their understanding. And just how, the professor asked, dreading the answer, would we judge this dance-off? And Dave's grin widened. Oh, that's the best part. We'll live stream it across the galaxy and let the viewers vote. It'll be like Dancing with the Stars, but with higher stakes and more tentacles. The professor's color shifted to a deep, troubled purple. Mr. Johnson, we cannot base important diplomatic decisions on a popularity contest. Why not? Dave countered. Isn't that basically what democracy is? Zixnax opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He took another swig of hyper whiskey, feeling the burn of the alien alcohol and the even stronger burn of his faith in the universe slowly dying. Okay, Dave said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. I can see you're not sold on the dance-off idea. How about this? We settle it with a cooking competition. The professor's ocular appendages twitched in confusion. A cooking competition. Yeah, we'll have a galactic scale cook-off. Each side presents their best dishes, and a panel of judges from neutral species decides the winner. It's perfect, no violence, no property damage, and everyone gets a good meal out of it. Zixnax had to admit, it was probably the least destructive idea the human had proposed so far. And what, pray tell, would Earth contribute to this culinary contest? Dave's eyes gleamed with mischief. 2 words, Prof. Taco Bell. The professor's translator glitched for a moment, unable to process the unfamiliar terms. Taco Bell? Is this some sort of Earth delicacy? Oh, it's delicious all right, Dave said with a wink. It's this amazing blend of meat and cheese wrapped in a tortilla. It's so good, it'll make their taste buds explode. Zixnax's color paled. Explode? Mr. Johnson, we've discussed this. No explosions. Dave laughed. No, not literally explode. It's just a saying. Although now that you mention it, some species might have some pretty explosive reactions to it. The professor slumped in his chair, feeling the onset of another headache. Mr. Johnson, perhaps we should return to more conventional diplomatic methods. Conventional? Boring, Dave exclaimed. Come on, Prof. Where's your sense of adventure? Your zest for the unconventional? Your willingness to push the boundaries of intergalactic relations? I believe I left it in my other tentacles, Zixnax muttered dryly. Dave leaned in conspiratorially. Okay, how about this? We challenge them to a game of intergalactic hide and seek. The professor blinked all 6 of his eyes in rapid succession. What? Think about it, Dave said, warming to his theme. We hide the asteroid belt somewhere in the galaxy, and whoever finds it first gets to keep it. It's like a treasure hunt, but with higher stakes. Zixnax stared at the human, wondering if perhaps he had accidentally ingested some hallucinogenic spores. Mr. Johnson, are you suggesting we physically relocate an entire asteroid belt for the sake of a children's game? Dave nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. It's brilliant, right? We'll need some pretty hefty tractor beams, of course, and maybe a few wormhole generators, but think of the fun. The professor took another long drink of hyper whiskey, draining the bottle. Mr. Johnson, I feel compelled to remind you that we are trying to resolve a conflict, not create an entirely new one by rearranging celestial bodies. Aw, you're no fun, Prof. Dave pouted. Okay, how about this? We settle it with a galactic version of rock, paper, scissors. Zixnax stared at Dave, his ocular appendages twitching in what could only be described as a mixture of disbelief and resignation. Mr. Johnson, are you suggesting we determine the fate of an entire asteroid belt based on a game of chance? Not just any game of chance, Prof. Dave exclaimed, his enthusiasm seemingly inexhaustible. We're talking about the ultimate test of strategy and psychological warfare. Rock crushes scissors, scissors cuts paper, paper covers rock. It's foolproof. A Centauri student who had cautiously peeked back into the classroom promptly retreated, their tentacles curling in distress. The professor massaged his gelatinous temples, feeling a migraine building in all 3 of his brains. Mr. Johnson, I failed to see how this primitive Earth game could possibly resolve an interstellar conflict. Dave leaned in, his eyes gleaming with mischief. But that's where you're wrong, Prof. We'll make it a best-of-3 tournament. Each side sends their top rock, paper, scissors champions. We'll broadcast it live across the galaxy. Think of the ratings. Ratings, Zixnax repeated weakly. Mr. Johnson, this isn't some form of entertainment. We're discussing serious diplomatic negotiations. Exactly, Dave exclaimed, pounding his fist on the desk for emphasis. And what's more serious than rock, paper, scissors? It's got everything: strategy, psychology, hand-eye coordination. It's like chess, but faster and with more hand cramps. The professor stared at the empty bottle of hyper whiskey, seriously contemplating if he could justify opening another one. Mr. Johnson, I'm beginning to suspect that your understanding of galactic diplomacy might be somewhat skewed. Dave grinned. Oh, come on, Prof, you've got to admit, it beats the usual boring stuff. Treaties, trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, yawn. Where's the pizzas? The excitement? The potential for hilarious misunderstandings that could lead to interstellar incidents. Zixnax's color shifted to an alarming shade of puce. Mr. Johnson, the point of diplomacy is to avoid interstellar incidents, not create them. But think of the stories we'd have to tell, Dave protested. Imagine it. The great rock, paper, scissors war of 2285, it'll be in history books for centuries. A Florvexian student who had been eavesdropping from the doorway suddenly illuminated in a pattern that roughly translated to "Oh, sweet bioluminescent ancestors, save us all." The professor took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of patience he possessed. "Mr. Johnson, while I appreciate your creative approach, perhaps we could explore some more traditional diplomatic methods." Dave's face fell. "Aw, Prof, you're killing me here. Traditional methods are so 20th century. We're living in the space age. We need space-age solutions. And your idea of a space-age solution is a children's game," Zixnax asked, his tone a mixture of exasperation and morbid curiosity. "Well, when you put it like that, it does sound a bit silly," Dave admitted. Then his eyes lit up again. "I know. We'll settle it with a giant mech battle." The professor's color drained entirely. What? Giant mech battle," Dave repeated, emphasizing each word. "Each side builds a massive robot. We're talking skyscraper-sized here. Then we duke it out on an uninhabited planet. Winner takes the asteroid belt." Zixnax stared at the human, his mind struggling to process the sheer insanity of the proposal. "Mr. Johnson, are you suggesting we resolve a minor border dispute by constructing enormous war machines and engaging in gladiatorial combat?" Dave nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. It's perfect. No civilian casualties, minimal environmental damage. Well, aside from the planet we fight on, but hey, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, right?" The professor slumped in his chair, feeling the last vestiges of his sanity slipping away. "Mr. Johnson, I feel compelled to remind you that the purpose of this class is to explore peaceful, diplomatic solutions to interstellar conflicts. And what's more peaceful than settling our differences with a good old-fashioned giant robot fight?" Dave countered. "It's like arm wrestling, but with more lasers and rocket punches." A Toraxian student who had been brave enough to return to class promptly fainted, their exoskeleton making a soft clink as they hit the floor. Zixnax took a deep breath, trying to center himself. "Mr. Johnson, perhaps we should take a step back and consider the root of the conflict. Why do both parties want this asteroid belt?" Dave scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, I guess it's probably for the resources, right? Metals, minerals, that kind of thing?" "Exactly," the professor said, feeling a glimmer of hope. "So instead of resorting to extreme measures, perhaps we could explore ways to share these resources equitably." Dave's eyes lit up. "Oh, I've got it. We'll turn the whole asteroid belt into a giant amusement park." The professor's hope died a quick and merciful death. I think about it," Dave said, warming to his theme. "We'll hollow out the biggest asteroids, fill them with rides and attractions. We'll have roller coasters that use the asteroid's low gravity, zero-G dance clubs, intergalactic food courts. We'll call it Space Mountain." "No, wait, I think that's taken. How about Asteroid Adventures?" Zixnax stared at the human, wondering if perhaps he was hallucinating this entire conversation. "Mr. Johnson, how exactly would an amusement park resolve the resource dispute?" "Easy," Dave exclaimed. "Both sides become shareholders in the park. They split the profits from ticket sales, concessions, overpriced souvenir t-shirts, the usual theme park stuff. Plus, think of the jobs it'll create. Construction workers, ride operators, mascots in uncomfortable alien costumes. The economic benefits are endless." The professor blinked slowly, trying to process this latest bout of human insanity. "Mr. Johnson, while your creativity is certainly impressive, I'm not sure turning a contested asteroid belt into a tourist attraction is a viable diplomatic solution." Dave leaned back in his chair, a smug grin on his face. "Why not? It's a win-win situation. Both sides get economic benefits. The galactic community gets a cool new vacation spot, and nobody has to resort to boring old traditional diplomacy." A Centauri student who had cautiously re-entered the classroom raised a tentacle. But what about the original resource dispute?" "Peesh. Resources," Dave scoffed. "Who needs boring old metals and minerals when you can have cotton candy and souvenir holo pics? Trust me, the I Survived the Asteroid Adventures Death Drop t-shirts will be worth way more than any space rocks." Zixnax massaged his temples, feeling a headache building in all three of his brains. "Mr. Johnson, while your proposal is certainly unique, I'm not sure it addresses the fundamental issues at stake here." Fundamental issues," Dave said with a dismissive wave. "Sometimes you've got to think outside the box. Prof. Oregon outside the asteroid belt, in this case." The professor took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of patience he possessed. "Very well, Mr. Johnson. Let's approach this from another angle. How would you suggest we handle the logistics of constructing an interstellar amusement park in a contested region of space?" Dave's eyes lit up with excitement. "Oh, that's the best part. We'll make the construction itself into a reality show. Extreme Makeover, Asteroid Edition. We'll have teams from both sides competing to build the best attractions. It'll be like a combination of the Great British Bake Off and Battlestar Galactica." A Florvexian student's bioluminescent patches flickered in a pattern that roughly translated to "I think I need to transfer to a different university." Zixnax slumped in his chair, feeling the last vestiges of his professional composure slipping away. "Mr. Johnson, I'm beginning to suspect that your approach to galactic diplomacy might be somewhat influenced by your planet's entertainment industry." Dave grinned. Well, why settle for boring old negotiations when you can have drama, suspense, and the occasional alien wardrobe malfunction? Think of the ratings. Ratings, the professor repeated weakly. Mr. Johnson, I feel compelled to remind you that we are not trying to create the next hit holodrama. We are attempting to resolve a serious interstellar conflict. But why can't it be both? Dave countered. Imagine the possibilities. Prof, we could have diplomatic adol, where representatives from both sides sing their peace proposals, or the amazing space race, where diplomats have to navigate through the contested asteroid belt while solving puzzles and avoiding space pirates. A Thoraxian student raised a trembling claw. Professor, is the human suggesting we turn galactic politics into some sort of game show? Before Zixnax could respond, Dave chimed in. Heck yeah. Think about it. Who wants to be a trillionaire asteroid mogul? It's educational and entertaining. The professor's color shifted to a deep, troubled purple. Mr. Johnson, while I appreciate your creative approach, I must insist that we focus on more conventional diplomatic methods. Dave's face fell. Aw, come on, Prof. Where's your sense of adventure? Your willingness to boldly go where no diplomat has gone before. I believe I left it in my other tentacles, Zixnax muttered dryly. Undeterred, Dave leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a manic light that the professor was beginning to recognize and fear. Okay, I've got it. The ultimate solution to our asteroid belt problem. Against his better judgment, Zixnax found himself asking, and what might that be, Mr. Johnson? Dave paused for dramatic effect, then declared, we'll weaponize interpretive dance. The classroom fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the soft thud of the last conscious Meplorpian finally fainting. Zixnax stared at the human, his ocular appendages twitching uncontrollably. Weaponize. Interpretive dance. Exactly, Dave exclaimed, bouncing in his seat with excitement. Picture this, we gather the greatest dancers from both sides. They perform an epic dance-off, interpreting their claims to the asteroid belt through the power of movement. The most compelling performance wins. The professor's color drained entirely, leaving him a translucent blob of disbelief. Mr. Johnson, are you actually suggesting we determine the fate of valuable space real estate based on rhythmic body movements? Not just any rhythmic body movements, Prof. Dave corrected. We're talking grand jeets that span light years, pirouettes that generate their own gravitational fields. We'll have dancers in zero-G suits, using asteroids as their stage. It'll be like Swan Lake meets Gravity but with more property law. A Centauri student's tentacles curled in confusion. But how would we judge such a contest? Dave's grin widened. That's the beauty of it. We'll assemble a panel of judges from neutral species. Throw in a few celebrity guests for good measure. Maybe get that three-headed pop star from Beetlejuice to do a guest performance. It'll be the greatest show this side of the galactic core. Professor Zixnax slumped against his desk, all pretense of composure abandoned. Mr. Johnson, I feel compelled to remind you, yet again, that we are trying to resolve a serious diplomatic situation, not create the next intergalactic entertainment sensation. But why can't it be both? Dave protested. Think about it, Prof. We're not just settling a border dispute here. We're creating understanding through art, fostering intergalactic goodwill through the universal language of dance. Plus, think of the merchandising opportunities. I survived the Great Asteroid Belt dance-off t-shirts would sell like hotcakes. The professor raised a gelatinous appendage. Mr. Johnson, while I appreciate your creativity, I must insist that we return to more conventional diplomatic methods. Perhaps we could discuss the possibility of a shared mining agreement or a neutral zone administered by a third party. Dave's face fell. Aw, Prof, you're killing me here. Shared mining agreements? Neutral zones? Where's the pizzas? The razzle-dazzle. The potential for hilarious mistranslations that could lead to interspecies incidents. Zixnax's color shifted to a deep, troubled purple. Mr. Johnson, the point of diplomacy is to avoid interspecies incidents, not create them. But think of the stories we'd have to tell, Dave exclaimed. Imagine it. The great intergalactic dance-off of 2285, it'll be in history books for centuries. The professor took a deep breath, summoning every last ounce of patience he possessed. Mr. Johnson, while your unique perspective certainly adds an interesting dimension to our discussions, I believe it's time we focused on more practical solutions. Dave leaned back in his chair, a mischievous glint in his eye. All right. I can see you're not sold on the dance-off idea. How about this? We settle it with a galaxy-wide game of capture the flag. Zixnax's ocular appendages swiveled wildly, taking in the scene of devastation that was once his orderly classroom. Unconscious Meplorpians, hyperventilating Florvexians, and catatonic Centauri filled the room, and in the midst of it all sat Dave Johnson, grinning like a lunatic and apparently oblivious to the havoc he'd wrought. With a Herculean effort, the professor pulled himself together. Mr. Johnson, I think perhaps it's time we took a break. Class dismissed. And someone please rehydrate the Meplorpians. As the shell-shocked students filed out of the room, many casting fearful glances at the still grinning human, Professor Zixnax collapsed into his chair. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a bottle of Rigelian Hyper whiskey, and took a long, deep swig. Galactic University of Advanced Warfare, he muttered to himself. More like Galactic University of Giving, main and aneurysm. Dave approached the desk, either oblivious to or simply ignoring the professor's distress. Hey, Prof, I've been thinking. If the dance-off is off the table, how about we settle this with a good old-fashioned potluck dinner? Zixnax stared at the human, then at the bottle in his hand, then back at the human. Without a word, he took another long drink. As the hyper whiskey burned its way through his digestive system, the professor found himself wondering, not for the first time, if perhaps humans were the galaxy's way of keeping things interesting, or more likely its way of driving every other sentient species to the brink of madness. Either way, one thing was certain: the next semester's curriculum was going to need some serious revisions, and possibly a warning label, "Caution may contain humans. Proceed at your own risk." As Dave opened his mouth, undoubtedly to suggest yet another outlandish solution to galactic diplomacy, the classroom door burst open. A harried-looking Zerblaxian administrator scuttled in, their eye stalks swiveling wildly. Professor Zixnax, the administrator, chittered urgently. "We have a situation." The professor's color shifted to a wary chartreuse. What now? Has someone accidentally weaponized interpretive dance? Dave perked up. "Hey, that was my idea." Ignoring the human, the administrator continued. "The diplomats from both sides of the asteroid belt dispute have arrived early. They're demanding to speak with our top strategic minds immediately." Zixnax's gelatinous form seemed to deflate. "Oh, cosmic rays, this is hardly the time for." "I've got this," Prof. Dave interrupted, springing to his feet with alarming enthusiasm. Before anyone could stop him, the human had bolted out the door, leaving a wake of bewildered aliens in his path. "Mr. Johnson, wait," Zixnax called out, his tentacles flailing in distress. But it was too late. The Deathworlder was loose in a building full of delicate diplomatic negotiations. What followed was a chaos that would be remembered in the annals of galactic history for centuries to come. Dave burst into the conference room where the two opposing delegations were already sizing each other up, tentacles twitching and eye stalks quivering with tension. "Gentle beings," Dave announced, his voice booming in the suddenly silent room. "I hear you've got a little disagreement about some space rocks. Well, buckle up, because I've got the solution to end all solutions." The delegates exchanged confused glances, their universal translators struggling to keep up with the human's rapid-fire speech. "First things first," Dave continued, oblivious to the growing alarm in the room. "We're gonna need about 1,000 gallons of lime jello, 300 pool noodles, and the biggest disco ball you can find. Trust me, it'll all make sense in the end." One of the delegates, a Zerblaxian with impressive head tendrils, managed to find their voice. "I what? Who is this creature?" "Oh, where are my manners?" Dave grinned, extending a hand. "Dave Johnson, future savior of galactic peace and part-time interpretive dance enthusiast. Now, about that jello." Meanwhile, back in the classroom, Professor Zixnax was having what could only be described as an existential crisis. "This is it," he muttered, cradling his bottle of hyper whiskey. "This is how it ends. Not with a bang, but with a human in a vat of gelatinous dessert." The Blaxian administrator's eye stalks drooped in sympathy. "Should we intervene?" Before Zixnax could answer, a cheer erupted from the conference room, followed by what sounded suspiciously like the opening chords of Stayin' Alive. "Oh, sweet asteroid dust," the professor groaned. He started the dance off. Curiosity overcoming their better judgment, Zixnax and the administrator peered into the conference room. The sight that greeted them would be seared into their collective memory for years to come. The dignified diplomats, representing species from across the galaxy, were engaged in what could only be described as the most enthusiastic and uncoordinated dance party the universe had ever witnessed. In the center of it all was Dave, demonstrating moves that seemed to defy both physics and common sense. "Come on, Ambassadors Lorbax," Dave shouted over the music. "Put those tentacles into it. And you emissary Krillix, I want to see those eye stalks boogie." To Zixnax's utter astonishment, they were complying. More than that, they seemed to be enjoying themselves. As the party reached its climax, with diplomats of all species attempting to master the intricacies of the robot, Dave somehow managed to guide the conversation towards the disputed asteroid belt. "You know," he said casually, executing a particularly impressive moonwalk, "instead of fighting over those asteroids, why don't you turn the whole belt into an intergalactic dance club? Split the profits, spread the love, and keep the party going." To Zixnax's eternal surprise, the idea was met with enthusiastic agreement. By the time the music faded and the disco ball slowly spun to a stop, a preliminary agreement had been drawn up on a cocktail napkin, signed by all parties and witnessed by the giant inflatable alien that had mysteriously appeared in the corner of the room. As the diplomats filed out, chattering excitedly about zoning permits and neon sign regulations, Dave sauntered over to the dumbstruck professor. "See, Prof," he grinned, straightening his somehow acquired sequin jacket. "Sometimes all you need to solve a galactic crisis is a little human ingenuity, a lot of bad dance moves, and a metric ton of jello." Zixnax stared at the human, then at the empty bottle in his hand, then back at the human. Without a word, he handed Dave his resignation letter. As news of the Great Galactic Dance-Off Peace Accord spread across the universe, reactions were mixed. Some hailed it as a revolutionary approach to diplomacy. Others feared it was the first sign of an impending cosmic apocalypse. But one thing was certain: the galaxy would never be the same again. And somewhere out there, a disco ball spun slowly in the void, a glittering monument to the day a human decided to solve an interstellar crisis with the power of dance. In the years that followed, the Galactic University of Advanced Warfare underwent some significant curriculum changes. A new course was added, Human-Style Negotiation Tactics. When all else fails, dance it out it became, much to the eternal bafflement of Professor Zixnax, the most popular class in the university's history. And as for Dave Johnson, well, let's just say that his unique approach to galactic diplomacy led to a very interesting career. But that, as they say, is a story for another day.